Warzone D doesn't announce itself. It absorbs you. The triple-canopy jungle of Phuoc Long Province swallows sound, swallows light, swallows the grid coordinates on your map until the paper in your hands becomes fiction. On the morning of November 8, 1965, 182 men of the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry moved through a world that had no interest in their mission, their training, or their survival. The trees grew so dense that artillery couldn't navigate the canopy to reach below it. Air support couldn't find them from above. They moved in a green darkness that didn't lift even at mid-morning. They were alone in ways the briefings had never fully addressed. They were the Sky Soldiers, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the first major Army combat unit deployed to Vietnam. Volunteers, every one of them. Men who had chosen the extra risk and the specific identity that came with jump wings, and the Maroon Beret, arriving from Okinawa 6 months earlier with a reputation built across 2 previous wars. But Warzone D was not a drop zone. It was a kill box selected months in advance with cold, deliberate patience by the 272nd Viet Cong Regiment. Veterans who had fought the French, who knew every depression, every tree line, every angle of fire in that specific piece of forest. One side knew exactly how the day would end. The other was learning that at 10:15. In the seconds before contact, the jungle went completely silent. No birds, no movement in the canopy. That specific, unnatural quiet pressed against them like something physical. Someone on the point element registered it. The wrong kind of silence that soldiers learn to read only after it's already too late. He didn't have time to say a word before the horseshoe closed around them from 3 sides at once. If you're watching this, you already understand that military history isn't about statistics or strategy papers. It's about the men who stood in places like Warzone D and refused to stop standing. Stories like this one don't reach the people who need to hear them without those who choose to find them. This channel exists to tell them with accuracy and the respect these men earned, without glorifying the war or simplifying the choices they faced under that canopy. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let the Sky Soldiers become a footnote beneath someone else's battle.
The 173rd Airborne Brigade arrived in Vietnam in May of 1965 as a statement of intent. The first full Army combat brigade in country, stepping off transport aircraft at Bien Hoa with the awareness that they were setting a precedent that couldn't be walked back. They came from Okinawa, where they had served as the Pacific Quick Reaction Force, and they brought with them a collective identity built on something most military units claim but few fully earn: the operational certainty that the man to your left and the man to your right would not leave you behind, regardless of the circumstance. For the 173rd, that was not rhetoric, it was doctrine. It was the thing that kept a unit functional when every other system failed. And it was the thing that Warzone D would test beyond any specification the doctrine had anticipated. By November of '65, 6 months in country had stripped away the initial clarity. The heat had done its work. The jungle had done its work. Rotting boots, rotting radios, rotting the certainty that American firepower and American training amounted to a decisive advantage in a war fought inside triple-canopy forest, with no road access and no clear front line. They had already buried men in Vietnamese soil. They had written letters home that said the necessary things without saying the true things. What remained after all of that was the core, the specific gravity of men who had counted the cost and kept walking anyway, not because the cost had stopped mattering, but because the men beside them had. Private correspondence preserved by the 173rd Airborne Brigade Association from that period speaks the same language across dozens of different hands. Different hometowns, different ranks, different reasons for enlisting. We take care of our own, not a slogan. An operating principle that had been tested and retested across 6 months of a war that was already harder than anyone in Washington had publicly acknowledged. One sergeant, whose name surfaces in a single survivor account as Danny, had carried a photograph in his left breast pocket since Okinawa, his sister's wedding, faces that had no knowledge of War Zone D. He was not exceptional in this. Nearly all of them carried something, a reason that existed before the war and would need to outlast it. War Zone D had no meaningful American presence for a reason that was simple and total. It had no road access, no clearings adequate for sustained operations, and a Viet Cong infrastructure so embedded in its geography that every tree line concealed something. A cache, a tunnel entrance, a pre-sighted firing position established long before the first American advisor arrived in the country. The French had attempted operations there. They had paid for the lesson. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam had pressed to the edges of the zone. They had not pressed further. By 1965, War Zone D functioned as sovereign enemy territory, 40 miles from the capital of South Vietnam, dense enough to be effectively impenetrable on the enemy's terms. Operation Hump was designed as a search and destroy mission, the dominant American strategic concept of the period. The logic was arithmetical. Find the main force enemy units, engage them, inflict casualties at a rate that Hanoi's political system couldn't absorb. Attrition as strategy. It made sense in the briefing rooms of Military Assistance Command Vietnam. It made a different calculation inside the canopy, where the advantages that made American forces formidable, close air support, artillery coordination, mechanized mobility, became one by one unavailable. What none of them had answered before that morning and most had not put into words was the question every soldier carries but rarely speaks. When the plan collapses and the radio can't reach and the man beside you goes down, what keeps you moving? War Zone D was about to make that question impossible to avoid. Stories like the one you're watching don't survive in official records. They survive because people carry them. Veterans who were there, families who kept the letters, researchers who refused to let November of '65 belong entirely to Ia Drang. If you served with the 173rd or knew someone who did, or carry any piece of this history in your family, the comments section is where that belongs. Not because a YouTube channel is a sufficient memorial, but because it may be one of the few places these stories still reach people who need to hear them. Add what you know. The 272nd Viet Cong Regiment had not chosen War Zone D by accident or desperation. They had chosen it because it was theirs, territory that their predecessors had held against the French, that their organization had fortified, mapped, and understood at a level of granular intimacy that no American unit could replicate through intelligence briefings or aerial reconnaissance. Their commanders knew which sections of canopy were thickest, which creek beds channeled sound in ways that masked approach, which angles of fire could be established to catch a column moving through the undergrowth with no room to maneuver left or right. They had pre-positioned ammunition, established withdrawal routes, and conducted rehearsals of the kind that military professionals on any side of any war would recognize as the mark of a force that took its work seriously. They were not a ragged insurgency improvising under pressure. They were a disciplined military organization executing a plan that had taken months to develop. Their confidence was not misplaced. They had watched the Americans operate for 6 months and drawn conclusions that the operational record largely supported. American units relied on fire support that jungle denied them. American doctrine assumed the ability to call in artillery or close air when a ground element made contact, an assumption that triple-canopy forest turned into a liability rather than a capability. The Americans also moved in predictable patterns, constrained by the same terrain features that made Warzone D valuable. A horseshoe ambush, 3 sides of fire closing on a column that had nowhere to go and no support that could reach them, was not a gamble. It was a calculation. The 272nd had done this before, against better-equipped enemies, and understood the physics of a trapped force in a way that operations orders written in Saigon could not. They were also, in every human dimension, young men with families and reasons for being there that were as complex and as real as any American soldiers. Many had grown up in villages that changed hands multiple times before they were old enough to choose a side. Some had seen French soldiers. Some had relatives who fought with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They had made a decision about which future they were willing to die to defend, and they had made it with the same seriousness that the men of the 173rd had made theirs. They were professionals. They were afraid, the way all soldiers are afraid before contact. They were waiting in the green silence of their chosen ground, certain, not wrongly, that they held every advantage that mattered in that specific piece of jungle on that specific morning. For the Sky Soldiers, the stakes extended well beyond the operational objective written in the order. If the 503rd could not maintain unit cohesion inside Warzone D's canopy, without artillery, without air support, without room to maneuver, the arithmetic of the entire American approach changed. Every commander in Military Assistance Command Vietnam was watching, in the indirect sense, how American infantry performed in denied terrain against a main force enemy that chose its own ground. The result of November 8th would be cited in after-action reports, studied in service schools, and used to argue cases for and against the strategic approach that had put these men in this jungle in the first place. Personally, for each man in the column, the stakes had a different shape, the specific weight of not coming home, and what that meant for specific people in specific towns who were, at that exact moment, going about their ordinary days. A failure of unit cohesion under that canopy was not an abstraction. It was names. It was addresses. The Sky Soldiers understood this the way all soldiers understand it, without needing to articulate it, because it is the thing that moves men forward when doctrine runs out. Whether the United States could project infantry force into denied jungle terrain against a prepared enemy that had chosen the time and place, that question would be answered before dark. But the more important question, the one that would follow the survivors across decades, was already forming in the silence before contact. When everything goes wrong at once, what does a unit made of individual human beings actually hold on to? The clock was running toward 10:15. If you're still watching, you already know something most people miss. That honoring these men means telling their story without looking away from what it cost. Subscribe and hit that like button. It tells YouTube these stories deserve to reach the people who need them. Understanding both sides isn't weakness. It's the only honest way to tell what happened under that canopy. The touch came first, not sound, not sight. The physical sensation of the air changing, the way a firefight announces itself through the skin before the ears register what's happening. The men at the point of the column felt it as a pressure change, a displacement in the thick, wet air of the jungle. a fraction of a second before the world came apart. That fraction was not enough time. It was never going to be enough time. The 272nd had positioned their automatic weapons at distances under 20 meters, close enough to make accuracy irrelevant, close enough to ensure that the first burst of fire would hit before the human nervous system had completed the signal from eye to brain to hand that said, "Take cover." They had measured this. They had chosen 20 meters precisely because it collapsed every advantage training provided. The sound arrived as a single thing, not individual weapons, but a wall of noise, a physical object that moved through the column and reorganized it instantly from a patrol into a casualty event. RPGs, AK-47s, light machine guns, and at least 2 mortar positions that had been pre-registered on the trail the column was using. The men who had been walking upright went to ground in the first half second out of training and instinct, and the ground gave them nothing. No berm, no tree wide enough, no depression that provided cover from 3 directions at once. The horseshoe was closing from left flank, right flank, and front, each position interlocking with the others so that movement away from one axis of fire moved directly into another. This was not an ambush that could be broken by individual courage and fire superiority. It was an equation that had been solved before the shooting started. The smell of the first seconds was cordite and something older, the iron smell that jungle soldiers learn to identify immediately and never forget. The smell of men bleeding into the same soil they were trying to take cover in, mixed with diesel residue from equipment, with the rotting vegetable smell of the jungle floor disturbed by bodies going prone, with the specific chemical smell of fear that is not metaphor, but biochemistry, something the body releases under extreme stress that those who've smelled it never mistake for anything else. The jungle above them remained identical to what it had been 30 seconds before. The canopy did not care. The trees did not move. The war happened beneath them without the jungle's acknowledgement, a violence invisible from 200 feet up, unreachable by anything flying above it. Vision was fragments. A man 3 positions forward, down and not moving. Another, further left, returning fire into a tree line he couldn't see through. The muzzle flashes of the 272nd's weapons visible for fractions of seconds at distances that felt impossibly close. 20 meters was a parking space, a living room, a distance at which you could see a face if the canopy let light through, which it didn't. Movement was happening in every direction simultaneously, and the brain, trained for sequential processing, was receiving information it couldn't organize fast enough to act on. This was the design. Overwhelm the decision-making capacity. Create a volume of simultaneous stimuli that training couldn't fully address. The 272nd understood the physiology of the trapped. The taste of it was dust and blood, and the inside of a clenched jaw, the copper taste that adrenaline produces. The accidental taste of jungle floor when a man's face pressed into the earth looking for cover that wasn't there. Every sense, simultaneously, reporting the same thing. This was the moment the briefings had named as a possibility, but that only existed as abstraction until it existed as this, as the specific weight of a specific afternoon, becoming the thing you carried for the rest of your life. On the other side of the tree line, the 272nd's unit commanders were coordinating through signals established in rehearsal, not radio, which the Americans could intercept, but visual signals, pre-assigned, that moved the attack's phases forward without electronic signature. Their initial volley had achieved its purpose. The column was pinned. The next phase was pressure. Sustained fire from all 3 legs of the horseshoe. No pause long enough for the Americans to organize a coherent response. No angle of withdrawal that wasn't covered. Their own casualties in those first minutes were real. The Sky Soldiers were returning fire even pinned, even disorganized, with the kind of disciplined aggression that trained airborne infantry produces even in the worst possible situation. The 272nd's commanders had expected this. They had not expected it to be quite this sustained, because the 503rd was doing something the horseshoe ambush was designed to prevent. They were communicating. Not over radio. The canopy and the noise made radio unreliable. They were communicating the way units under fire communicate when everything else fails. Voices, hands, the specific gestures that muscle memory produces when training is deep enough to survive the dissolution of conscious control. Squad leaders who were still up were moving to their men. Men who were still up were moving to their wounded. The equation the 272nd had solved was holding. The Americans were pinned, casualties were mounting, close air support wasn't coming. But the unit had not broken. It had not fragmented into individuals running in separate directions. It held a shape, ragged and bleeding, but a shape. At the moment the 272nd's second mortar volley landed, designed to collapse the center of the column, something resolved itself in the understanding of every man still able to think. The answer to the question of what kept you moving when the plan collapsed wasn't doctrine and it wasn't training. It was the specific faces around you and the specific knowledge that you were the only reason some of them were still alive. That was the loop closing. The silence before contact, the question underneath every conversation they hadn't had, answered now in the loudest possible terms. They were fighting for each other because there was nothing else left to fight for, and it turned out that was sufficient. Barely, but sufficient. But that was only the beginning of what November 8th would cost them. The first lull came approximately 40 minutes into contact. Not a ceasefire, not a withdrawal, but a pause in the intensity that the human nervous system interpreted as relief even when the mind knew better. The 272nd was adjusting its positions, shifting the pressure, but to a man still in the fight, the drop in volume from overwhelming to merely intense felt for a few seconds, like breathing room. Men who had been firing continuously checked their ammunition. Someone passed water. A sergeant whose voice had been directing fire for 40 minutes discovered he had been shouting into a throat that had gone raw without his noticing. In the pause, the sounds that the firefight had been covering returned. The jungle above them, unchanged, indifferent. Birds, even now, somewhere in the canopy. The specific unreality of a war being fought beneath a living world that continued its ordinary operations directly overhead. The photograph that Danny carried, his sister's wedding, faces that knew nothing of this, had survived the first 40 minutes in his left breast pocket. He had not looked at it. He didn't need to. He knew it was there the way soldiers know where their ammunition is by a specific gravity that the body tracks without being asked. In the pause, one man near him produced a letter, half read, started before contact and not finished. He folded it back, set it against his rifle, said nothing. These were the objects they had brought from the world that existed before this one, and the question underneath them, whether that world would still be there when this was over, had no useful answer in the middle of a contact that wasn't finished. The 272nd was still there. The horseshoe was still there. The pause was a breath, not a resolution. On the other side of the tree line, the pause had its own texture. A 272nd squad leader, repositioning his element 20 meters through the undergrowth, was communicating in the pre-rehearsed signals. 2 fingers, then a closed fist, then a direction. His men moved without sound through a jungle they had trained in for months. He had losses too, real ones. Men he knew by the specific way they moved through undergrowth, by the sound of their breathing in a tight patrol formation. He was processing those losses the way combat soldiers process them. Later. The mission wasn't finished. Later was not now. He moved his element to its new position and waited for the signal to re-engage. Then the situation changed in a way that had no clean answer. A group of wounded, American wounded, 4 of them, unable to move under their own power, had been consolidated in a low depression approximately 30 meters back from the original point of contact. One man was keeping them alive, applying pressure, doing what could be done without a medic kit that had been lost in the first minutes of contact. Getting those 4 men to a landing zone required either a route through the left flank of the horseshoe, which was still active, or a route through terrain so dense that moving 4 non-ambulatory men through it would take time that the 270 repositioning wasn't going to provide. The senior NCO, still upright and able to make decisions, had at maximum 90 seconds to choose. Commit the men needed to extract the wounded through the left flank, which might break the horseshoe's left leg if they hit it hard enough, but would expose the extraction element to concentrated fire or hold position. Keep the horseshoe from closing further, and leave the 4 men in the depression until the tactical situation changed in ways that were not guaranteed. What would you do? Not as a thought experiment, not with the clarity of distance and time. With 40 minutes of combat exhaustion behind you, with your throat raw and your hands not entirely steady, with 4 specific faces 30 meters back, and the knowledge that the next 60 seconds would be the answer you lived with. Your men are looking at you. The 272nd is 2 minutes from completing its repositioning. The jungle above you has not moved. There is no manual that covers this exact geometry with these exact stakes. The decision came from the place decisions come from when everything else has been stripped away. Commit to the extraction. Hit the left flank hard enough to suppress it. Move the wounded through the gap. Collapse back to a defensible position. The cost was immediate and visible. 2 more men went down in the push through the left flank. One of them the sergeant who had been directing fire from the beginning. But the 4 men in the depression came out. The left leg of the horseshoe did not close, and the promise that every man in that column had made to every other man, the promise underneath the doctrine, the thing the letters home never said directly but always meant, held. At a price that would not stop accumulating for the rest of the day and for every day afterward. The choice was made. The consequences were just beginning. The radio reached someone at approximately 1430. Not close air support. The canopy still made that impossible. But a relay had been established, a fragile chain of signals bouncing between the 1/503rd's position and elements of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry operating in the broader area of operations. The message that came back was not reinforcements, not a reaction force close enough to matter in the next hour. It was acknowledgement. Command knew where they were, knew they were in sustained contact, and a relief element was moving. How fast that element could move through War Zone D's terrain was a question no one answered directly, because the answer was not fast enough to change the next several hours. What it changed was something harder to quantify. They were not, after all, invisible. Someone knew the coordinate. Someone was moving in their direction. In the calculus of a unit that had been fighting alone for 4 hours, that information had weight beyond its tactical significance. The Sky Soldiers used it, not as a reason to wait. Waiting was not an option the tactical situation provided. but as a point of reference that allowed something like coherent decision-making to resume where controlled chaos had been running the operation. Senior NCOs who had been managing local crises in their immediate sectors began, haltingly, to coordinate across sectors in ways the first hours hadn't permitted. The wounded were consolidated. Ammunition was redistributed from the dead to the living with the specific efficiency that combat produces and that no training can fully replicate. Not because training hadn't addressed it, but because the reality of doing it had a weight that the training scenario never carried. They moved their casualties. They reorganized their perimeter. They counted what they had and matched it to what the 272nd's positions seemed to require to hold. What was happening was not a reversal of the ambush's physics. The horseshoe was still there. The 272nd still held the prepared positions, still had the local knowledge, still had the advantage of ground they had chosen. What was changing was the equation underneath the physics. The 272nd had designed this contact for a unit that would fragment, that would break into individuals running in separate directions, that would surrender the coherence that made a military unit something other than a group of armed men in proximity. The 503rd had not fragmented. After 4 hours of the worst contact a unit could endure without supporting fires, they were still a unit, battered, bloodied, carrying losses that would take years to fully reckon with. But a unit. It wasn't about firepower. It was about refusing to become what the ambush had been designed to produce. The 272nd's commanders recognized this. The after-dark withdrawal that began in the early hours of November 9th was not a panicked retreat. It was a professional decision by a professional force that had achieved significant objectives and was now facing a situation that was no longer moving in their favor. The Sky Soldiers had not broken. The reaction element was moving. The cost-benefit calculation of continuing to press a force that had demonstrated it would not collapse had shifted. They withdrew through the jungle with the same discipline they had brought to the ambush, covering their own withdrawal, maintaining unit integrity, leaving behind a battlefield that told a story neither side would find fully comfortable in the accounting. What remained when the firing stopped was not victory in any clean sense. The objectives of Operation Hump had not been achieved in the terms the order had specified. The 272nd had not been destroyed or decisively engaged in the conventional sense. What had been proved, at a cost that the men still standing were only beginning to understand, was something that couldn't be written in an operations order. That American infantry could absorb the worst a prepared enemy in ideal terrain could deliver, and maintain unit cohesion, and bring out their dead, and still be standing when the jungle went quiet. What the war would do with that proof was a different question. The tactical reality had been settled. What War Zone D had decided about strategy, about the arithmetic of attrition, about whether this kind of war could be won at all, was a question that would take another decade to answer, at a cost these men were not yet able to imagine. The question of whether holding ground in War Zone D could win a war being fought in conference rooms in Washington and Saigon, that question had not been settled. It would not be settled in War Zone D. It would be settled slowly, in places these men would never see, by decisions made by people who would never spend a night in that jungle. The Sky Soldiers had done their part. Victory came. But the cost was still being counted. 49 names, not a statistic. 49 specific men with specific hometowns and specific families who had been alive at 10:14 on November 8th and were not alive at 10:15. Men from Georgia and California and Ohio and Texas and places smaller than those. towns where a telegram would arrive and change the population of every room in a house permanently. Their ages clustered in the early 20s with outliers on both ends, a few teenagers, a few men whose children were already old enough to understand what the telegram meant. They had first names that their mothers used and last names that appear in the after-action report as the Army records them, which is not the same as the names their men used, which is not the same as the names they used for themselves. 49 men. The number exists as a fact. The weight of it exists as something facts are not equipped to carry. 83 wounded, a portion of whom would carry the physical evidence of November 8th for the rest of their lives. Men who had been whole at 10/14 and were not whole at 10/15. And who would spend decades explaining to medical personnel and to themselves what a piece of metal moving at velocity through specific tissue actually means in functional terms. Years later, in a grocery store, in a VA waiting room, in the specific moment when a body reminds a person of something the mind had been managing to set aside. The 272nd had paid too. No verified body count exists that historians treat as reliable. The numbers that appear in contemporary records were generated under combat conditions by a unit managing its own casualties and attempting to assess enemy losses without the ability to conduct a thorough battlefield survey. What is verifiable is that the 272nd withdrew, that they withdrew in good order, and that they had fought with the competence and courage of a professional force that believed in what it was doing and executed its mission with skill. Their dead had hometowns too, in the northern provinces and in hamlets in War Zone D itself, and in places that no American intelligence report had mapped with human detail. They had families who would receive word through a different system, in a different language, and who would carry the same weight that families carry regardless of which side of a war their son was on. The silence that followed the withdrawal was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. After hours of fire, the absence of it pressed against the ears with the same physicality the firefight had, differently oriented, differently shaped, but equally heavy. Men who had been in continuous motion for hours found that stopping revealed what motion had been managing. The pain of wounds they hadn't fully registered, the specific exhaustion that the body produces when it has been running on adrenaline longer than adrenaline was designed to sustain. The awareness, arriving in waves of what the roll call was going to sound like. Danny's photograph had survived, still in the left breast pocket, slightly damp from a day of sweat and jungle moisture, but intact. He looked at it in the silence after the firing stopped. The faces at the wedding, the ordinary brightness of a day that had no knowledge of War Zone D. The photograph meant something different now than it had when he put it there in Okinawa. It wasn't a reason anymore. It was a question. Whether the world in that photograph was still the world he was going to return to, or whether something had been altered in the exchange between that morning and this evening that made the distance between those faces and this jungle permanently unbridgeable. He didn't know yet. He put it back. The unspoken promise, we take care of our own, had been kept at a cost that made the keeping feel in that silence almost indistinguishable from breaking. 4 men had come out of the depression because others had gone through the left flank, and 2 of those others were names on the list now. The arithmetic of the promise was not simple. It was never simple. But the promise had held. That was the thing they would return to in the decades of nights when the silence after the firefight returned uninvited. It had held at a price that didn't stop accumulating for the rest of their lives. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to years, and the weight never got lighter. The survivors of November 8th dispersed after the 173rd's tour to stateside assignments, to second tours, to the specific civilian lives that men construct around the shape of what they've carried home. Some of them found each other at reunions organized by the 173rd Airborne Brigade Association, where the distance of years produced a particular kind of conversation. Careful at first, then not careful at all, then careful again in the way of men who have learned that some things require a specific audience to be said out loud. They talked about the men whose names were on the list. They talked more carefully about the decisions that led to November 8th, not to assign blame, but because the war had given them questions that official histories didn't answer and that civilian life didn't create space to ask. They had done their jobs. They had done them with everything the Army had given them, and a great deal the Army hadn't anticipated they would need. Whether their jobs had been worth doing, that was the question that followed them through the decades like the sound of the jungle going silent before contact. Some of them slept badly for years without understanding why until a therapist or a fellow veteran gave the mechanism a name. Some of them drank, and some of them stopped drinking, and some of them did not stop drinking, and all of those outcomes were comprehensible to anyone who understood what 48 hours in War Zone D in 1965 had actually asked of a human nervous system. The ones who found their way back to something functional, to marriages, to work, to the specific daily texture of a life built after that war, didn't find their way back by forgetting. They found it by learning to carry the weight without being defined entirely by it. That was the life's work. For most of them, it was never finished. The men on the other side of November 8th carried their version of the same weight home. The 272nd's survivors returned to a different country, a different political structure, a different reckoning. But the fundamental human experience of having survived something that others did not survive, of having made decisions under fire that cost lives, of having been young and certain and then old and less certain, that experience does not require a shared uniform. It requires only having been there on either side of the tree line in the specific silence before the horseshoe closed. War creates this. It creates it equally, regardless of whose flag was correct. The 173rd Airborne Brigade Association has preserved what the official record didn't. Letters, photographs, names that appear in survivor accounts informs the after-action report didn't capture. Not ranks and service numbers, but nicknames and hometowns and the specific way a man laughed or carried his weapon or kept a photograph in his left breast pocket. This is what survives when the strategy arguments have exhausted themselves. Not the attrition calculus, not the conference room decisions. The human record, imperfect, partial, kept alive by the people who were there and the families of the people who weren't there to keep it themselves. The Sky Soldiers served honorably. The men of the 272nd served honorably. They served with the skill and the courage that combat demands, and that deserves recognition regardless of which side of the tree line you were standing on. The fault, when there was fault, lay in the decisions made far from War Zone D, by people who would not carry the weight of November 8th through decades of difficult sleep and reunion conversations and photographs kept in pockets. The soldiers did their part. Whether the leaders did theirs is the question the historical record leaves unresolved, and it is a question worth asking even now, especially now. Danny's photograph is somewhere, in a box in Ohio perhaps, or passed to a nephew who knows the rough shape of the story without knowing the details that only the jungle held. The dog tags of the men on the list are with families who kept them, and in some cases with families who couldn't keep them for reasons the weight made comprehensible. We don't leave men behind. That was the promise. It held in War Zone D. What the war didn't hold was different and larger, and that difference is the thing worth sitting with. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences matter. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars,